All right, welcome back for more Atheist Edge, folks. Thank you for watching. We're back again today with William Albrecht, Catholic debater and apologist. We've had him on previously to talk just a general Catholic chat. Today we're going to get a little bit more specifically talking about the resurrection, only the most important event in the history of Christendom, and kind of talk about the implications of that, and we'll see where we go from there. So, William, first of all, thank you for joining us again. We're glad to have you.
Thank you for
Um,
having me on. I really enjoy the show.
Thank you. Let's frame the question this way, because a lot of our audience, just by virtue of growing up in Western civilization, a lot of us grew up in some form of Christianity, are very familiar with the resurrection story, and have ultimately rejected it for one reason or another. What do you think, in your opinion, would be the best reason or reasons for us to kind of reconsider that and maybe take a second look at the resurrection?
What I find the most compelling when dialoguing about the resurrection, um, the one thing that I realize is not going to really attract people is telling them to open the Bible and read the Bible. I mean, to begin with, I know most atheists don't take the Bible to be the Word of God. I totally get that. I totally understand that. What I think is the strongest point of the resurrection is looking at the narratives and then stepping outside, looking at what the enemies of the faith had to say. Now, they don't believe Christ bodily rose from the dead,
Mm-hmm.
but they testify to the fact that the earliest followers did believe that. And when you then look at what people like Josephus wrote, Tacitus, Lucian of Samosata, the enemies that testify to the fact that Christ really lived, walked the earth, was crucified, died. And then we look at what the earliest followers of Christ had to say, guys like Ignatius of Antioch, Clement of Rome, Polycarp. I think when we read their writing, when we read their testimony to the earliest followers of the faith, and the fact that they all believed Christ bodily rose from the dead, we supplement that with what is being said in the Bible. I think the evidence is overwhelming that Christ indeed lived, died, and bodily rose from the dead. I find it to be very, very compelling. But the approach that I take is very different from that of an evangelical
Mm-hmm.
who will confine themselves to the Bible alone and argue that the Bible has enough tenacity, enough conviction in and of itself to prove that Christ rose from the dead. Sure, I believe that. I do believe that. But I like to go outside as well and to use evidence outside of the Bible to prove that the bodily resurrection has very strong testimonies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that, and this is barring fun in-house atheist debates. Like, mythicism is a fun thing to talk about. I don't personally
Yeah,
subscribe to it, and so far it still seems to be a minority position, although with very vocal proponents. But that's
yeah,
not a position I'm prepared to defend today. Some of the stuff you said, I know even secular biblical scholars would have zero problem with the idea that
yeah,
Jesus was a real person who existed in first
yeah,
century Palestine, the idea that he was crucified by the Romans, the idea that the earliest believers certainly believed that he had a resurrection of some kind. For our purposes today, I don't think it's necessary to delve into the spiritual or bodily resurrection debate. I know you just talked with Dan Barker on that,
yeah.
and he is probably way more equipped to talk about that specific aspect of it than I am. So what we'll just say it was believed that he resurrected in some fashion. The sticking point that we have is what happened in between all that. Um, I am perfectly comfortable with the idea that the apostles believed that Jesus rode, and they passed that down to the early church fathers, the early Christian writers who you would reference as evidence,
Yeah,
even to non Christian writers like Tacitus and other historians who also reference that, hey, there was this sect in Judea that worshiped this guy who they say rose from the dead.
yeah,
So all that is uh, it's all there, and I'm willing to grant pretty much all of that, but it's also kind of irrelevant if it could also all be wrong, especially the what Christians believed afterwards.
Yeah,
And that's where I think uh,
no
we,
doubt. They could have been lunatics just following a maniacal cult leader. I grant that. I grant that people may look at it like that and say, you know what? Um, what was the name of that cult leader in Dallas? Koreshi?
Koresh.
I'm trying. Yeah, I mean, people believed him, drank the Kool-Aid. You know, I can perfectly understand what you're saying in the sense that, okay, just because people believed and were willing to die, that in and of itself doesn't make it to be true. And I understand that as well. That is why I believe there are many other elements as well in terms of believing that Christ did bodily rise from the dead.
So what's gonna so what am I missing here? What's going to if we have like all this we agree on all this stuff, but
Yeah.
still somehow we're on different sides of the fence. So where's the disconnect here? What am I missing as a non-believer that could, in theory, push me over the edge, going back to becoming a believer again?
Well, what I find very compelling is not just harking to the early fathers. What I find really compelling about them is if you read the writings of Polycarp, and I know it's kind of tough because he doesn't have a whole lot that he wrote, and it's a little bit technical. You kind of have to break the Greek down to really get what he's saying, and even Ignatius. But they don't claim to have only been taught by the apostles, and they don't only claim to believe what was told of them, but rather they argue that they knew the risen Christ, that they saw him bodily risen. That I find to be very compelling. I don't really hear that brought up very often. In fact, when I hear guys like Michael Acona and others, by the way, they're very good, probably better debaters than myself when it comes to the resurrection. I'm not knocking them at all. I never hear them bring that up. I find that to be incredible that they say they knew the risen Christ, and then we flip it to the other side. Well, okay, well, maybe they were lying, right? Maybe they were crazy and went to their own martyrdom, but maybe they were lying. Why don't we have the writings of anyone contemporaneous to them claiming that they were just lying or they were wrong? The earliest writing that I find is from Celsus, preserved in Origin, which does come later. And he does claim that Christians are just wacko out of their mind. But he comes much later, and we do have the writings of other enemies preserved. Why don't we have anything of people saying, well, you know what? This is total baloney. We don't have any written record of enemies coming forth claiming it to have been false. I mean, that to me, I know that's an argument from silence, and I'm not using that as proof that he definitively rose from the dead. But I do think that that does lend weight to the fact that the earliest writers from the biblical era, then we go into the post-biblical era, believe Christ bodily rose from the dead. They provide themselves as testimony to the fact that they viewed and saw and communed with the risen Christ, and we don't have anybody testifying to the contrary. I just find that to be very compelling evidence. Then coupling that with, I know it would be a whole other show, but what I find to be incredibly convincing and compelling as well are Eucharistic miracles. Because within Catholicism, and not just Catholicism, but Orthodoxy, the two most ancient branches of Christianity, which would be Catholicism and Orthodoxy, we connect the resurrection with the Eucharist. And that is one area where I'm sure you might be aware of it, but guys like Dan Barker and other atheists, they just don't ever deal with it. Not because they can't deal with it, but because they primarily debate with evangelicals. And for the ancient church, the Eucharist was very much connected with the fact that Christ bodily rose from the dead.
Okay, a couple things there with the
Yeah.
issue of the lack of dissenting writers. Part of that may be, and like you said, this maybe isn't a slam dunk either way because arguments of
Yeah.
silence are hard
I'm with
to
you there.
support. But one, there was not. I imagine the church would be interested in preserving documents that from their history, just as many organizations would. And I don't know if they would necessarily. I don't want to accuse them of quashing dissent necessarily. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. I certainly don't know, but they may not have carefully preserved dissenting documents, and there may not have been a central anti-Christian body that would have necessarily been as dedicated to preserving the opposition as a church would have been at presenting or saving their own history. So that could be coming into play here. But then again, maybe there was not dissent. Once again, we're dealing with kind of the scraps of history, and we don't always
No doubt.
have all the info we want to have. So
Yeah.
that's we're just kind of stuck with that 2,000 years later, working with whatever info we have. As to the Eucharistic miracles, can you go a little bit more into kind of what that is and how that lends support to the resurrection in the
Yeah.
Catholic view?
Yeah, let me touch upon the before I go into that, let me briefly touch upon the fact that we really are lacking a lot. Could that be due to the fact that maybe the early church really were kind of just trying to stamp out opposition? I think that might be the case once we get to maybe the 4th century. But before that, really, the church was on the run, hiding underground and being martyred and being killed. I don't think that they would have. Maybe they would have wanted to squash out anything that would have been heretical. I don't think they did a very good job of that, because we have Celsus, whose writings are preserved. We have a lot of Gnosticism, and we have Josephus, who was preserved by the church. They preserved his writings for a long time. And if you look at him, he was no friend of the faith. Of course, granted, later on, interpolations began to creep in with writers claiming that Josephus believed Christ had been the Messiah. I don't believe that that is legitimate. I don't. What I do believe is legitimate is Josephus did believe Christ existed and that he did die, that he was killed, he was crucified and died on the cross. So I think that there's really no way for me to prove to you, hey, these writings are evidence for my position. And I think, as you admitted, it's tough to prove it either which way. It really would be tough to prove it either which way. But when we talk about the Eucharist, the reason as a Catholic we view that to be so powerful is because if you look at 1 Corinthians, and you can find it in my debate when I debated Dan Barker, when Paul begins to talk about the fact that Christ is bodily risen from the dead, before that in 1 Corinthians 11, he talks about the fact that the risen Christ left with him the words of institution of the Last Supper, what we call the Mass. So he then begins to talk about how when you say the words of consecration of the bread and wine, that it becomes the body and the blood of Christ. A few chapters later, he then begins to talk about the bodily risen Christ. But if you notice one thing in the writings of Paul, not just there, but you can also find it in other works of his, he seems to give an indication, actually he straight out says, that he believes the Eucharist is the body and the blood of Christ. And I know evangelicals would have a bone of contention in terms of this, but the early church was unanimous in this, in believing this. You fast forward maybe about 40 years later to a guy by the name of Ignatius of Antioch, who begins to echo what Paul says and begins to say the very fact that Christ bodily rose from the dead, he is our antidote. He is our, trying to remember the word he used, he is our medicine of immortality. And he connects the bodily risen Christ with the fact that when a priest says the words of institution, the body and blood of Christ become present to us. So that has always been connected. The fact that we believe Christ is present here on earth and as well in heaven, bodily, that from the beginning has always been connected with the Eucharist. We then look at the fact that within the church, there have been miracles where the host has, blood has come out of the host, or even out of the wine, or bits of flesh have seemed to have been transformed from the host. There are many miracles that have been preserved over history that we believe as Catholics. We're not bound to believe it. Eucharistic miracles are not part of public revelation, if you will. They're not part of divine revelation. We're not required to believe them. But when we begin to study and look at the evidence, I think the evidence is very overwhelming that a number of these are definitely miracles, miraculous.
Do you have uh, do you have a good example of one that obviously I'm not really
Yeah,
in a position to look into to pull up a lot of
sure.
information right now while we're recording, but for our viewers who may want to look into this,
Yeah.
is there a good example of something that they could bring out as like the example for people who want to find out more about this?
Well, I'll point to two. One of them in Ondex, Germany, and another one, probably the most famous one, in Lanciano, Italy. The miracle of Lanciano, Italy. I think those are very, very powerful, very compelling, to where scientists have even looked at it and really don't know what is going on there. I think that they're very, very compelling and incredible. There are many more, but in terms of being able to look up on Google without having to buy a book, those two are very well attested for.
Okay. I guess I'm going to wind up being a little bit pedantic here because we're trying to connect all this to the resurrection, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
and I welcome any objection. You can even tell me, hey, you know what? I don't see the connection at all. Totally up for hearing everything. I think we should be able to get into the nitty gritty. If you think that I'm completely wrong, that they doesn't make any sense at all, let me know.
yeah, I mean, if I don't want to be. I'm sounding like one of those overly skeptical people that I normally find annoying. So I'm trying to be careful how I put this. But uh, the resurrection, regardless of whether Eucharistic miracles can be demonstrated or not,
Sure,
we're ultimately talking about a historical event, right?
no doubt.
So when we're talking about history, kind of like we were saying before with the letters and what the early church or what the early first century writers were and were not writing about Christianity for it against it. We don't always have all the information we want. We're working with what we have. So
Fragments, yeah,
when,
no
when, when
doubt.
we're when we're talking about the resurrection as a historical event, do you think we have enough information to say this is more likely than not what actually occurred as opposed to any other more mundane explanation?
Yeah, I don't think Paul really knew fully when he was writing 1 Corinthians or Romans that, as Catholics would say, that he was writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. I think if we look at the way the letters were written, they weren't written with the intention of being put in a volume.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul didn't sit down and write 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians or Romans or Colossians and think, well, tomorrow, we're going to have it compiled in a Bible.
Mm-hmm.
There was no Bible, excuse me, for over 380 years. There wasn't a Bible. I mean, we have to be clear about it. And there sure weren't any pigskin Bibles for much longer. There was no printing press. So people weren't walking around with their Bibles. These were letters that were being passed along the churches, being preserved orally, being preserved on parchment, if you will. And they were believed not because they were part of a divine Bible at the time. They were believed by the communities because the communities had seen the risen Christ, or either had maybe not seen him, but had heard the preaching and were so compelled by the miracles that they had seen Christ either do before he died or even do after he had resurrected. So I think that the writings are very compelling in that sense. When we and it's very hard to disconnect our mentality from a modern day mentality of having the Bible in hardback or paperback format. And back then, that really wasn't present. So not like they were walking around with a Bible and an established faith that they had to kind of believe in or were kind of indoctrinated into. They really weren't. These were mostly fresh converts from Judaism. I mean, they really had no reason to believe, to put their lives in danger and to become martyrs. They just really had no reason.
Well, if we're talking, okay, first of all, let me ask you this: where do you date the gospel writings from like Mark starting?
I'm pretty conservative. I think Mark was very early. Maybe uh, I'd probably put it in the 50s.
In the
I'd probably
50s?
put Mark. Yeah, I would put Mark very early. Um, I guess I'm a little bit more liberal with John in the sense that I do think John was later. I think John did come a little bit later, not as late as some as the Jesus Seminar would maybe put it. I think Acts was definitely first century. I've seen modern scholars and liberal scholars kind of put Acts around second century. I don't think Acts was that late. I think Paul was written. I think Luke wrote Acts because when we look at the tradition, the manuscript tradition, we have a lot of early manuscripts of Luke connected with Acts. Basically, almost considered the same work at times. So I do think that they're relatively early. Scholars, even atheist scholars, will argue that 1 Corinthians was written within a few years of the death of Christ, the creed
Mm-hmm.
or tract or whatever you want to call it. They're not arguing it's true.
Mm-hmm.
They're arguing that it comes from a very early period, though. And I think when we look at the fact that it does come from a very early period, this is being passed along to the churches. The people had seen the risen Christ. I think it's very, very compelling evidence. To me, I think it's very powerful evidence, really. And coupled with the early church writings as well, which began to get circulated along with the Gospels. Even some people even thought 1 Clement was biblical for a part of time there as well. So I find it very compelling.
But if we're talking about the very very earliest transmission of Christian doctrine and these writings, and it's being passed down either through oral tradition, and I know there was more of an oral transmission culture back then where they were used to that kind
Yeah.
of thing, but also even the writing tradition. This was not. I know apologists I've dealt with in the past have liked to make a big deal of the Middle Ages monastic tradition and how careful they were to check all their manuscripts and and if
Yeah.
even one letter was off, they threw the whole thing
Sure.
out. But this was before all that. There was not necessarily a formalized check and
Mm-hmm.
balance system of copying these things to be sent to Corinth or Ephesus or what have you.
Yeah.
So I guess in the interim period between Jesus' death and the Gospels starting to be written down, how can we be assured? Because ultimately everything hinges on that period. It all branches from there. How can we be assured that the information was being transmitted accurately,
Yeah.
that it wasn't even inadvertently being exaggerated or people putting their own spin on things until it became an actual orthodoxy being set in stone?
I think that's probably one of the best questions that anybody can ever pose. And it goes to the heart of whether or not the text can be trusted.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that when we approach it as a Catholic, the way I would approach it as a Catholic, or when any scholar within the Catholic field would approach it, we go right back to the point that in the early church, there was no Bible. There wasn't a Bible. But then you go right back to the point of, okay, well, maybe there wasn't a Bible, but how can you be certain that what was being passed along just wasn't being messed with? I can easily point to you and tell you that the divine oral preaching, which was called a paradosis in the Greek, was viewed as something so powerful that the divine tradition was put on par with the written word. But that still wouldn't be very convincing. So then how do we get to the point that how do you know that maybe the words are not, maybe the words aren't exact, maybe something differs here, maybe something differs there, because if you look at the words of institution of the Eucharist, even those differ even slightly.
Mm-hmm.
So you've brought up an excellent point. And I go right back to Paul. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, when he is enunciating this teaching that he's been given, I argue that he's been given it from Christ. I think that we can be definitely certain that he has preserved the heart of the teaching that Christ bodily rose from the dead. Now, the words of consecration are a debate for a whole other day, but I think that he's preserved the heart of the teaching that Christ bodily rose from the dead. Now, how can I prove that? I think that if a virtual outsider like Paul, because he wasn't part of the 12 originally, if a virtual outsider like Paul would have come along and would have opposed the true teaching of the inner group, I think that they would have definitely been up in arms. We would have had something that would have existed from Peter, from James, from any of them saying this guy is fudging the facts. We don't have any of that. And we have written letters of Paul. Even scholars recognize Paul may not have written the one, Peter, excuse me. We have letters of Peter. Even if scholars say maybe Peter didn't write 1 Peter, he still transmitted what was taught there. We have a letter of Peter. And whereas we know that they really weren't always on the same page because Paul opposes Peter to his face, we have written evidence that Paul says that he went and he gathered with Peter and was taught by Peter. The Greek word used there is historicide, to go and gather evidence, to be taught, and what have you. So we can be certain that the heart of the teaching, even if maybe the words word for word were different in Aramaic or what have you, and then when they transfer over to Greek, maybe there's something different. The fact that Christ bodily rose from the dead was preserved because we have so much testimony. Even if we reject Paul, we have testimony from Peter. And then you may ask, well, how can we be certain that that is, there's nothing been lost there? It would be, to me, too much to claim, well, Paul got it wrong. Okay, fine. Well, did Peter get it wrong? And even if you say, okay, well, Peter got it wrong too. But then we have Clement, who was ordained by Peter, who also wrote in Clement in his letter to the Corinthians. So we have a chain of testimony that goes on and on of these witnesses, of these eyewitnesses. I think that there would have been a disconnect. At least one person saying he didn't bodily rise from the dead, but there's nothing there, and it's all from a very early period.
Can you briefly, because I haven't heard the thing about Clement before, can you
Sure.
go into a little bit the justification for calling him
Yeah.
an eyewitness? 'Cause I don't remember if he was mentioned in the
Oh,
Bible at all, or
yeah, he is mentioned in the Bible. Yeah, I can pull it up. I mean, I'm sorry, I should have had it open. He does appear in the Bible. He is considered one of the most prominent early figures. So we have two writings, one Clement and two Clement. Two Clement is most definitely pseudonymous, definitely not from him. But you can find Clement in Philippians 4:3, where Paul is talking about traveling with this gentleman. And not just there. When you look at him in Philippians 4:3, you've got Clementos in the Greek, it's Clement. But you have more evidence for Clement in The Shepherd of Hermas, which was written late first century. In section 7 and 9, it talks about his office, and it talks about his office being one that has control over the whole world. And it would fit in perfectly because as a Catholic, we believed him to have been the Bishop of Rome, to have been the shepherd of the whole church. So you have him there, and then you have more testimony of him when you get to Tertullian, who, when Tertullian is writing around 190 AD, he says the Church of Rome, which recognizes Clement to have been ordained in like manner by Peter. So there's a big chain of witnesses here. And I'm totally with you when you say, well, how can we be certain nothing was lost? To me, I see a great chain of ancient testimony, and I just don't see any disconnect there with anybody saying, hey, Christ was eaten by dogs, by wild rabid dogs. He died, they ate his body, and we discarded the bones, or something along those lines. Instead, we have everybody believing in the bodily risen Christ.
well, what's interesting is because I know uh, it's pretty well known, at least as far as my understanding, is that the crucifixion victims were very rarely given proper burials. I know they
Right.
have. I know they have found foot bones with a nail through them. So we have at
Yeah.
least one guy who got a burial. So it's not impossible, but odds
Yeah.
are against it. Um,
Yeah.
uh, so is it?
That's a good point.
I forgot where I was going with that.
No, no, I kind of know where you're going. Maybe, you know, what's to say that the destitute, because he was not rich, destitute Christ would have been given a proper burial. We only hear of this gentleman that would have given his tomb up for him. Very rarely. We don't have much evidence of him or anything. What's to say his body wasn't just tossed somewhere and lost? And I will tell you why I don't believe that happened. Aside from the fact that I believe he did rise from the dead, I think that the early Romans would have wanted to have kept tabs on where his body was. I think they would have, so that they would have prevented the early Christians from having gone there and venerated the body. Because if you look and you notice what Mary, I believe Mary Magdalene, I'm trying to remember what other, I think the two Marys, were still going to the tomb to venerate the body. Even though they didn't know that he had risen from the dead, they were going to go and they were going to take the spices and what have you and cry over the body. I think it would have behooved the Romans to have kept an eye, to have made sure that these cult-like crazy people in their mind would not have gone and made an uprising and stolen the body to venerate it or what have you. I think it would have been important for them to have kept tabs on that body.
Well, we're kind of trying to get into
Yeah,
the heads of
no
ancient
doubt.
people,
Right, yeah.
to my mind, it's equally likely that they could have been, finally, this is done with. We can dump them in the pit, and we'll never
Could have
hear
been
from
as
these
well.
people ever again. And they could have, and that was it. So they wouldn't have bothered to
Yeah.
keep tabs because they thought this Jesus cult was done once and for all.
And
And
that's a
lo and
viable opinion as
behold, it
well.
survived underground, and before they knew it, it was popping back up all over the place. And they were writing letters to each
Yeah.
other, trying to figure out what to do about it. So,
Sure, and that's a viable opinion as well to take as a skeptic to say, well, this could have very well been their position as well. I myself believe that the tomb did become empty because it did rise from the dead. I think the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. But I understand looking at it and saying, you know what, why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that to the body? As a skeptic, I would also ask that same question.
so let me ask you this. I've asked this of a bunch of people and gotten a bunch of
Yeah,
different answers. The varying gospel accounts of
yeah,
the morning of the resurrection.
yeah,
If there was ever, you know, I know atheists like to talk about contradictions in the Bible, and there's some that are more troublesome than others. Some of them don't really mean anything. If there was
yeah,
10,000 men in one army and 100,000 in another book, whatever. But when it comes to the resurrection, uh, it's supposed to be the central event in the entire Bible. It's the watershed
yeah.
moment, and the accounts are all over the place. Like they agree on the empty tomb, and that's about it. You have
Right.
women coming, various numbers of them,
Hmm.
to a tomb that was both open or closed, and they see one or two men or angels
Yeah.
before or after Peter comes,
Hmm.
after which he leaves, and the disciples either go to Galilee or stay put. And the tomb itself was chosen either because it was Joseph of Arimathea's or because it just happens to be closed. There's all sorts of stuff going on in there. And you can kind of make a case, like you were saying before with Peter and Paul, saying, well, okay, they all
Yeah.
agree on the resurrection. That's the most important
Hmm.
thing. But at the same time, if we're talking about an event that from the outside looking in seems like crazy unlikely, on almost impossible, uh, how do you think we can come to terms with the fact that these accounts of an already seemingly disbelievable event vary so widely in their narrative?
That to me, that's an excellent question. I'm very well aware of how many evangelicals deal with that. I've heard them say, well, even if we grant discrepancies in the text, even if we grant contradictions, if you will, the heart of the fact that Christ bodily rose from the dead is not affected by that. I've heard that many times. My problem with that approach is, as a Catholic, I believe the text to be inerrant.
Mhm.
I don't think that there are contradictions. So I would not take that approach. The approach that I would take is the fact that, and there's tons of them. Dan Barker, I think, lists about 70 of them. I don't think the fact that one author mentioning two men and another mentioning one, or one saying one man and one saying two angels, I don't think that would affect my belief, in the sense that I don't believe all the authors are being exhaustive. I don't think that they're being exhaustive. One man may say man, one writer might say man, the other might say angel. My problem with that kind of my problem with the kind of argument of saying, well, one of them said angel, the other one says men, is the fact that if you look in the Old Testament, a lot of times angels appear as men, and the Greek word is used for them as anthropos, used interchangeably with angelos. So, and even Dan Barker's admitted that, well, maybe they were angels. The problem is, just because one will describe them as looking like angels but call them anthropos, and another author will describe them the same way and call them angel, I don't find that to be a discrepancy. And I don't think it's a problem with the text. If you look at Paul, his Corinthian account, you don't have all the figures appearing there as they would appear in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. I don't think Paul is trying to be exhaustive. I don't think he's trying to give a narrative account. I think he's recounting a teaching that was given to him by Christ, and not trying to be exhaustive in that sense. What I would find to be a contradiction, and I don't find it there, I don't find it in any of the narratives, would be if an author would say there was only one woman and no other women. You don't ever find that. Instead, you have them giving a narrative style explanation. One may list one angel, one may list two, but I don't think they're contradicting each other, because I don't think all of them are being exhaustive. And the argument, I've heard it brought up many times on did they stay in Galilee? Did they go? Or what have you? I don't find that to be very compelling, because they could have stayed for a while and then left at a later time. The problem I see with that approach is it's looking at the Bible, looking at that one passage, and thinking that it is an exhaustive statement, that simply because Christ said they had to stay put there, that they then never ever left that location. I just don't find these arguments compelling, and I've looked at all of them.
Well, here's what maybe it comes down to. Do you think? I'll put this kind of snarkily, and then I'll step back from it. Do you think God could have done better? Because these are things that atheists and prospective Christians have been looking at for millennia,
Mm-hmm.
and these are whether they should be or shouldn't, and whether there's explanations for them or actual legit reasons within the text, they are stumbling blocks for
Mm-hmm.
believers. And this is supposed to be a divine text, and I could understand if it is a human text, that you have writers putting their creative flair on and talking about men, and say using as a artistic way of saying angels and meaning for their readers to understand an allusion to the Old Testament because they are Jewish and familiar with it, when in reality this is a document that's going to be read for millennia and millennia afterwards by all different
Yeah.
kinds of people who may not understand that, and they're reading it in their own languages. And my thought as a dubiously okay writer is, if you mean angels, just say angels. Let's avoid the confusion. If you see two people, and don't just, it's equally as easy to say there were two people as there was to say one person. So why do you leave the second person out? Like, what did he do wrong that you don't even mention him? It seems like God could have done well to inspire the writing in such a fashion that you could avoid some of these issues.
Yeah, I find that to be a fantastic, fantastic question, and I appreciate it because it's very important, and it doesn't frequently come up in dialogue when Catholics dialogue. But we need to realize that there's a human element to the text. We don't argue that. Now, you posed a question that I found to be very, very good, very compelling. Could God have made them better writers? Maybe. Well, the to me the issue with that is in Catholicism and in ancient Christianity, we don't believe that God is a puppet master. So we believe in heaven and hell, of course. We don't believe that God will make you go to hell. We believe that if you become damned, if you are damned to eternal torment, which, by the way, I personally don't believe that there are a whole lot of people in hell. I can at least hope that. We don't believe that God sends people in the sense of being a puppet master to hell. So we believe the text to be divine, but we believe it was written by human beings under the inspiration of the Holy Ghost. It's been the teaching from the very beginning, but their writing style is still preserved nonetheless. So when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, there are areas where they do line up perfectly. But then when you read John in the Greek and compare that to Mark, it's very different. You can tell it's written at a different time period, from a very different author who had a very different style of Greek. So we believe the human element is still preserved despite the fact that it was written under divine inspiration. Then you bring up another really good point. Why not simply say they were angels rather than they were, men in white garb? I think the one thing that we need to realize is when the gospel writers were writing, when they were writing, as I brought up, they wouldn't have believed that this would have been a bone of contention with the people that were reading it because this was taught orally. It was being preached from the pulpit. It wasn't being handed over to them from the Bible, what they were going to open and maybe not have somebody there to guide them.
Mm-hmm.
There was a format set up from the beginning. There was the way the church was set up by Christ from the start. It was the scripture and the oral tradition, the oral teaching, the oral paradosis in the Greek. And that was handed on by the church from the very beginning. So there wouldn't have been any confusion. The authors wouldn't have had to worry because it still was being preached from the pulpit and the people would have known what was being taught. Now you can still ask, well, wouldn't God have been smart enough to have known that later on in time there would be other people that would maybe not have access to the preaching to be taught? What is the issue in that sense? Well, I think when we look at it that way, the way I always compare, when I see men dressed in white, and then another gospel says there were angels, this is exactly the way it was in the Old Testament. Many times angels would appear. They would appear and they would be called men. I think the audience, any time period that you look at, would have known that these were angels. That is what I think. And that's a testimony that I read from guys like Thomas Aquinas and really any medieval writer. They were aware that the term anthropos, man, was used interchangeably for angel at times in the Old Testament.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's one of those things that I'm not
Do
gonna
you,
hang.
do
I'm
you,
not
do
gonna
you,
hang my hat on that particular man versus angels thing. I'm just
right? I'm
pointing
curious.
out
So
that it's kind of
if I can pose it to you, I'm curious.
yeah.
Do you think, and it's a legitimate question, do you think any of these supposed contradictions, does the resurrection of Christ hinge upon these supposed contradictions? I'm curious.
Well, or we're talking about credibility here, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
there could be all these contradictions in the narrative, and it
Hmm.
still happened. But if we're talking
Okay.
about what it takes to believe a certain thing, like the example
Hmm.
I've used before is like, let's say I'm getting together with my friends, and all of them come
Hmm.
rushing in from the backyard and say, "Hey, we saw a Bigfoot running by." And
Yeah.
one of them says, "I saw the Bigfoot, and he was wearing a pink or pink tutu and eating ice cream." Another
Right.
says, "I saw a Bigfoot, and he was wearing a baseball uniform and eating a hot dog." And the other one says, "I saw Bigfoot, and he was wearing a bathing suit and eating pizza." I'm not going to think to myself, well, they definitely saw a Bigfoot. They have all that in common. I'm going to think to myself
Right.
that all these people are insane and I need better friends.
Right.
That's kind of way it looks at. I look at it from the gospel accounts, and I'll acknowledge that part of this too kind of depends on how much credibility you're willing to give supernatural events just at
Yeah.
a base amount. Because
Sure.
I'll acknowledge that I lean naturalist. I'm not a philosophical naturalist. I'm willing to
You don't believe in
consider.
the supernatural at all?
I have. I'm like I said. I'll go where the evidence leads,
Okay.
and the problem I have with the supernatural, and you can tell me what you think about this. With the natural world, we have a pretty robust methodology through science
Oh yeah.
to look at data, perform experiments, form models, and try and figure out how stuff works in it. But
Sure.
for the supernatural world, I think of it as a sealed, impenetrable box where literally anything anyone wants to conceive of can be put in there. That's where people put ghosts, that's where people
Yeah.
put ESP, and we really don't have a way to see into the box.
Okay.
We don't have any test we can do, we don't have any experiments we can run. We have very
So you do
little.
you do you do believe maybe spirits do exist, but you wouldn't classify them as perhaps supernatural?
Let's think. I'm willing to consider any proposition that someone wants to put forth, but
Yeah.
I think that someone putting forth those propositions is kind of up
Better have
against
good
they're
evidence.
up
Yeah.
against the eight ball. I don't know how you evidence something uh, that's fundamentally on another plane of existence, and the way
Right.
that theists would normally deal with that is through logic, something that try to reason about what may be in there without and that can maybe get you to. I always mix up valid and sound in these aspects, but they
Right.
can make it get you to a plausible definition of God, but then you gotta show that that thing actually exists, which is where the challenge comes in.
Right.
Um,
But you would agree that arguing for the bodily resurrection of Christ, it's not the same thing as arguing for the existence of God. You would agree with that at least.
right. I'm just talking about,
Okay.
okay, the supernatural in general. Like if you are
Sure.
like, I'm not of the mind to give a whole lot of credence to supernatural explanations, but some people are
Sure.
very apt to that. And for them, especially if they already have some sort of God belief of some kind, and they
Yeah.
believe that a God exists, not even necessarily the Christian God, but a God exists who intervenes in the natural world on occasion and pokes around and messes with our lives. That saying that could happen, for a such a God to resurrect a person, sure, if you want to go that route. But for me, kind of like a Sasquatch example, any kind of resurrection someone wants to put forth, be it the resurrection of Christ or any other, there are other variations of Christianity and other religions that claim resurrections from the dead, and I would give those kind of a low default credibility rating, I guess. I'm just not apt to believe those things
Yeah.
in the same way that I'm not apt to believe Bigfoot sightings, and it's going to take a little
Would you
bit.
be open to at least looking at the evidence for Eucharistic miracles? Would you be open to at least looking at that?
Yeah, like I said, you gave a couple examples. I'd definitely be open
Yeah,
to looking into that, just because growing up
yeah.
Protestant, that's outside of my experience. But
I've even got scientific journals published on the issue that I found to be very difficult to find online. That I wouldn't mind sharing with you and getting your honest thoughts about it.
yeah, like if you want to message me those links after
I
the
sure will.
show, I'd certainly be willing to
Oh
look
yeah,
into that.
no
Uh,
doubt. Yeah.
so, but setting aside that for now, where are we going with that? But yeah, talking about what I'll be willing to believe, it just seems like I think I talked last time a little bit about my personal pet theory, kind of talking about possible hallucinations that disciples or a disciple may have had, combined with legendary embellishment that is natural with storytelling as repeated
Mhm.
from person to person. I could see where that could get to something closer to the gospel accounts. And if we're talking about history, we're trying to figure out what most likely happened. Even if we grant resurrections are possible, then that's kind of kicker, is that even if we grant resurrections, they don't happen a whole lot, even under the Christian worldview. So it
But that would
I
be a massive, massive amount of hallucinations in many different parts of the world. And I've looked at the issue of mass hallucinations. I mean, to me, quite frankly, I think that and it's not always the Orthodox Muslim position. I think that if we're going to argue against the resurrection of Christ, that to take an unorthodox Muslim position makes more sense than the mass hallucination. And to say, well, maybe he didn't even die. Maybe that's why he was seen by so many people, which I don't believe. I think that that's a bad argument as well. I think that makes more sense than many people in many different locations having seen him. I've never seen a case of mass hallucination working that way.
Well, to be clear, I'm not talking about mass hallucinations here. I mean, what
Okay, okay, my bad.
the post
I
resurrection.
misunderstood.
Oh yeah, I understand. But it's post resurrection appearances.
Mhm.
What do we have? Theoretically, we have the 500 that Paul mentions, but
More than, yeah,
more than 500.
right.
But he's the only one that mentions that, which I
Mhm.
find weird. And once again, doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I find it
Yeah,
very strange that he mentions that and none of the gospel authors do. So
right.
I'm not really inclined to accept that
Well,
just
you've
because.
got Paul. Yeah, I don't think that the gospel writers mention it. They mention him appearing to many people, and then Matthew mentions the tombs of the saints being opened after the resurrection, and many of the dead raising and walking the earth. But as far as I know, Paul is the only one that does mention the more than 500. I think he's using exaggerated language. Um, I think he does mean more than 500, but I think he's using that particular number to exaggerate the fact that it was a lot of people. It was pretty
Mhm.
much everybody in the region that would have seen Christ. I think that's why he uses that language. But you also have Polycarp writing later to a church and telling them that the Christ that they saw beforehand, that they saw when he had risen from the dead, that he's no longer there with them. He's ascended to heaven, and then he begins giving his authority and teaching as a bishop because he was a bishop of the church. So, I find that at least to take the position that it must have been a hallucination, I think that I don't find that to be compelling. Maybe there are other arguments a little bit more compelling. I don't find the hallucination one very compelling, though. We would have to have had a bunch of them in different
Mhm.
locations.
Well, real quick on the Polycarp thing, when he says
Yeah,
the visions, when he says that they saw the risen Christ, is he saying that the
yeah,
church he's writing to saw them, or that he
yeah.
and the apostles saw, like Polycarp and the believers
No,
saw them?
no, he's talking. He's talking to the church that he's writing to. He's talking about the fact that they knew Christ before, they had seen Christ before, but he's no longer there with them. Now, I will grant with you, we don't know how many people he's writing to. We don't know.
Mhm.
We don't know the actual target audience. Was it a church of 10, 20, 30 or more? But regardless, we have people like him, Ignatius of Antioch, and other people in different locations that we know at least claimed to have seen the risen
Mhm.
Christ. To me, it's just too many people in different locations to
Mhm.
fall in line and make a case for the
Mhm.
hallucination
Yeah,
scenario.
yeah, that much I know nothing about.
Right,
So
right,
yeah,
yeah,
I would have to look into that further.
sure, sure.
But as far as the Gospels are concerned, or the New Testament as a whole, we have the
Yeah,
500, which only Paul mentions. We
yeah.
have the people on the road to Emmaus, which only Luke
Mm-hmm.
mentions. We have the rising of the saints out of their graves, which only Matthew mentions. Um, for the most
Well,
part, in
Bible wise, yeah, Bible wise, but you do have the rising of the saints and all these testified to in the apostolic era. So remember the issue of, okay, you're right. In terms of the Bible,
Mhm.
they're only mentioned by these people, but the rising of the saints is mentioned by a lot of apostolic figures. So you have that only by Matthew. You're right about
Mhm.
that. But it's also mentioned by Ignatius, Polycarp, and many other writers that are writing in a very early era, testifying to the fact that these people did actually rise. So I understand. I think it's a little bit of a flawed kind of methodology. I understand it's very, very logical the position you're taking, saying, okay, well, this is only mentioned here, only mentioned there. But if we kind of, and it's very difficult to do this, if we kind of take our mind outside of just looking at the Bible and
Mhm.
realizing that the Bible wasn't even the Bible yet,
Mhm.
there are other ancient testimonies that validate what is being written here in these letters that were really at this point in time when shortly after Christ ascended to heaven that we believe they were simply just letters being passed around. We don't have any established canonical list yet. There are other people writing, testifying to the veracity of these claims.
So I think what I'm getting for all this is I need to read more of the early church fathers because there's a lot of stuff going on in there that
There's a
maybe.
ton, and I'd love to share it with you. I compiled a list of a ton of ancient authors that that agree with Matthew's account. I think it was in Matthew
Mhm.
28 or 27. I don't remember where, but I realize it's also very popular amongst evangelicals who like to take the position and like to claim that, well, maybe that is a literary device that really didn't happen. I do believe that happened. I'm more along the traditional line.
Mhm.
I do believe that did really occur.
And we're talking about authors that agree with Matthew's account. Is it
Correct.
that they are? Um, were they also there to witness that, and they're writing as eyewitnesses, or are they just possibly referring to a existing tradition, which could be Matthew or could be what Matthew was basing his account off of?
That is excellent. Unfortunately, I don't know. I haven't examined all of them. What I can tell you is that the words differ from what Matthew writes. Instead, we have Ignatius um, testifying to the fact that it occurred. I don't know if Ignatius was an eyewitness. As far as I know, when I say I don't know if any of them were eyewitnesses or claimed to have been there.
Mhm.
Most likely, I'm going to go um, with what I believe. I don't think they were there. I'll
Mhm.
say that. I think they're relaying what was taught to them, what was told to them. But then we go to the period of St. Augustine, who wouldn't fulfill the apostolic criteria. He's writing around the fourth century, who does claim that this was very well known at that time period, that it really did occur, that it was a historical event. But of course, he does come at a later period. But I think that that does lend credence to the fact that in the apostolic era, they were testifying to the fact that it occurred. We leave the apostolic era, even when we get to the time of Augustine. Augustine is testifying to the fact that this was an actual historical event that did occur in the life of the church.
Yeah, because what I'd be interested to see, and once again, we're getting back to an argument from silence here, so I don't want to take this too far, but we have history being written about Judea in that period by people who were there at the time, and they weren't necessarily talking about Christianity because that wasn't necessarily big enough to write about at that time. But
Right.
a mass rising of the dead from the graves, surely that would have made the local news in some fashion. Like someone when writing about the history of Roman Judea would write. And then there was this
Hmm.
time in 33 AD when everyone freaked out because the dead were walking around town. And it's
Do you think maybe they wouldn't have been writing about it because it would have been centralized to that particular location? Even that being posed to you, who do we have contemporaneous to that time outside of Josephus that even wrote an account of anything that happened?
it's been a very long time when it was I know David Fitzgerald in one of his books. He lists a number of individuals who were writing that time, and I'm doing myself a disservice by not remembering any names. But
I'd love to
uh,
hear because I really don't know of any Jews that were writing around that time period earlier than Josephus, whose writings we still have. I really can't think of any. I might
right,
be wrong. You could very well catch me flat-footed here. I might be wrong there. I
right,
can't think of any though.
yeah. Like I said, I would have to go back and look at his stuff and give
Yeah,
you some
yeah,
names. But
I'd love to check it out. Mhm.
um,
We
let's
do have
see.
Romans writing, but I can agree with that we do have Roman writers writing.
But you don't think Romans would have written about that time because they were
Well, a lot of the stuff is very fragmentary. We don't have a whole lot of stuff being testified in some of these Roman writings. We don't have historical figures that we know existed being mentioned by a lot of these early Roman writings. I don't think they're exhaustive.
Mhm.
Um, or maybe they didn't even know about it. It's very possible they didn't know about it. It could have occurred in a centralized location. There's so many things that really, really could say, you know what? Why didn't this pagan Roman writer testify to this having occurred?
Mhm.
Well, they don't testify to everything as having occurred, and we have a lot of them. Just really fragments of the writings that exist.
Mhm. Yeah, like I said, I acknowledge argument from silence, so I'm not going to be
By the
like,
way, here's something very interesting. Rufinus is a writer around, I want to say, fourth century or late fourth century, who does mention somebody having written, an early pagan writer having written about that event. So that is very, very compelling. Now, here's the problem: we don't have that writing anymore.
mhm.
So again, I can say, well, Rufinus is writing around this time period. In his hands, he did have something that testifies to the fact that this occurred, but we can't examine that. We don't
Mhm.
have that anymore. That writing that he mentions doesn't exist.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. Actually, I think I've read about that at some point. But
Okay, yeah,
um, do you want to get into some maybe non-resurrection stuff here?
sure,
I
definitely.
could probably talk about that all day, but it was
Oh
interesting. Some
yeah,
other stuff to talk about. 'Cause I was dealing with I was talking with another Catholic individual online, back and forth, and he was talking about the way that Catholicism views God, and it wasn't a way I was kind of the way I've historically thought about. So I was interested in getting your view on it.
sure.
He was putting forth a view that God is necessarily uh, is utterly simple. That was the way that
Okay,
he put it. And it
right.
was simple to the point that God did not have any properties,
Okay.
in the sense that
Oh,
having properties would be a violation of divine simplicity,
okay.
which struck me as odd because a God that is triune, if
Yeah.
nothing else, would one have properties and two not be especially simple. Uh,
Yeah.
so I wasn't sure if that was a mainstream Catholic view of God
It
or
is not. Yeah,
okay.
it's not, but it is a valid school of thought. It is a valid school of thought. So we have various schools of thought. That is one valid one. That is not one that I would subscribe to, but that has become popular as of late. It really comes, a lot of it comes from an influence from the Eastern branch of the faith. Eastern Catholicism, if you will describe God in that fashion by his very nature. I imagine he meant by his very nature when he described God as being totally and utterly simplistic. That comes from the Eastern tradition. It is a valid school of thought, but it is not one that, and when I say valid, it's valid in the sense that it can be reconciled with other schools of thought, but it would not be a mainstream one, not one that you really find in a lot of textbooks of Catholic
Mhm.
theology. Not very, very. You can find it in Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. I don't know if you've ever read that book or if you have that book. It's a voluminous work where pretty much every essential Catholic teaching and dogma can be found within it. You can definitely find it in there, but almost, I don't want to say almost like a footnote, but almost there's not a lot of it really touched upon in that book.
Mhm. So, how does so? What's the difference then? Is it in the simplicity aspect? Is it in
Yep.
the having properties aspect? What is this
Yeah,
school of thought getting that's
you
a little off
see,
base?
Catholics generally, when we talk about God, we describe God as being triune.
Hmm.
So three persons that are distinct from one another, but one in unity, one in nature and one in unity, but three persons in the Godhead, as we call it. That's the doctrine of the Trinity. But Catholics tend to go much deeper. When we talk about God, we tend to describe God as being a God of justice, a God of love, a God of caring. And usually, when we also describe God, Catholics tend to put a lot of emphasis on the qualities of Christ. Not that that's bad or wrong, but we need to recognize Christ as the second person of the Trinity. So it can get a little bit complicated. It can actually take up a lot of time when talking about God,
Hmm.
because do we talk about God in God's very nature? Or do we then begin talking about the attributes of each person of the Godhead? And it can become very overwhelming and very confusing as well to somebody on the outside looking in who really just want simplicity being explained to them. And in that sense, sometimes the other approach is a lot more appealing rather than somebody like myself trying to break down the fact that we believe that God is justice, God is just, excuse me, God is loving, God is caring, and going into all the other attributes that you can find in the person of Christ in the Bible and outside of the Bible. So there's many, many methods that we can tackle the nature of God, many methods of being able to tackle what we mean by the nature of God. But it can definitely be very confusing when we talk about the fact that we believe God is a Trinity, God is triune. Then you have people looking at it from the outside and saying, well, wouldn't that be three gods? Well, we don't believe Trinity to be three gods. We believe there to be three persons, completely distinct persons in the Godhead, but united in nature and united in mission. Does that make any sense, or is it really completely confusing?
I think it's confusing to a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm
It's
sure you've heard it many times, though.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, I grew up making similar arguments, and I think they made sense to me at the time. And try to make sense of them, taking a step back is
Does the Trinity not make sense to you anymore, even as a non-believer? Let's say you would say, okay, look, I'm not a believer, but I get the doctrine of the Trinity. I know what you're trying to say. Or do you completely say it's nonsense?
well. Let me ask you this: when we're talking about the nature of God, which
Yeah,
all these three distinct persons ostensibly have in common, are we
yeah,
talking about this nature in the same way that we would talk about human nature? Because we could talk
yeah,
about how a
yeah,
person is, and we can say, oh,
yeah,
that person is just a crappy person. It's in their nature, or they're
yeah,
talkative by nature, or they're generous by nature. We're talking about attributes that they share,
yeah,
but they're distinctly separate people. They're separate
yeah,
beings, and we
yeah,
understand that. What?
That's an excellent point because um, no, we don't mean it in the same sense. In fact, we even go further and we distinguish when talking about Christ, the person of Christ. We make a very major distinction in the sense that Christ has a human nature and a divine nature. But as Catholics, we go even further. We also believe he had a human will and a divine will. So when talking about God, we're very, very meticulous in the way, in the kind of discussion we have when it comes to the personhood of Christ. And by the way, this teaching is very important because if you deny the divine and human nature of Christ and the divine will and the human will, uh, your whole orthodoxy within Catholicism hinges upon believing that. Because if you don't believe it, you can't be Catholic.
Mhm.
You're not following Catholic teaching. And these teachings are actually ancient. So can you find them taught word for word in the Bible? I mean, really, you can't. I mean, as honest as we have to be, they're not hammered out word for word in the Bible, but they are taught in early church councils. And we believe those councils were guided by the Holy Spirit. We believe they were protected from error in their dogmatic definitions.
It seems like,
Seems
and
like it's a lot. Not very simple,
it
I
is a
know.
lot, and now we're kind of have a new question because, uh, once again, I feel like we're using the term nature differently, which is why I was trying to
We probably
clarify
are.
that
Yeah, yeah, we probably are.
because I don't know how one thing can have two natures. Like a
Yeah,
nature to me, and the way I think of it, is just how a person is,
yeah.
which is vague enough to be unhelpful. But
Right.
it's kind of a description of all
It's confusing language.
of all the traits and attributes that go to, for instance, make me me,
Yeah,
and someone else would have a whole set of traits and attributes that make them them.
no doubt.
But Jesus can have a set of attributes that make Jesus Jesus.
Yeah,
And I don't know how he can have be 100% two things. Like obviously it's
yeah,
not a math problem, but that's
yeah.
kind of the way we're thinking of it. Like a person can't be unless we're talking multiple personalities, which would be interesting way
Heresy.
of looking at it. I'm sure very heretical, and maybe that was in there in the first century and got kind of shoved
But
aside very quickly. But
that's excellent though. That's such a thought provoking kind of a statement you made there because I agree with you. When you think of nature, the way you said it, you kind of think of everything that makes up your very person, basically. And I agree with you. The way we think of nature, that is how our human nature is, and pretty much how everybody's human nature would be. The one distinction we would make is the only exception would be Christ. And the reason we believe him to be the only exception is because we believe him to have been the only one to become incarnate for us, to have actually taken on flesh. That being said, why would we believe him to have a human nature and a divine nature? We would believe that because we believe him to have existed before, to be eternal God, to have existed, as John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, talking about the very fact that the Logos, Christ, was eternal, eternally existed. So that attribute would have to belong to him, even if he took flesh upon himself, even if he became human for our sake. So the reason we call him the one exception is we believe him to be eternal God. Then he became man for our sake. He would have a divine nature and a human nature, but he would be the only exception in the history of humanity.
so what would be wrong with, hypothetically trying to make this a little bit simpler? What would be wrong with saying that Jesus had a divine nature and only a divine nature, but in a
Yeah,
physical human body? Um,
yeah.
I'm sure that's a heresy that's been out there somewhere before. But is there anything like why wouldn't that solve the issue?
Yeah, it wouldn't solve the issue because for Catholics, we believe Christ willfully gave himself up and died on the cross. If he wouldn't have had, if he would have just been in a human body and not had a human nature, then he would not have been able to grow in wisdom as a child, as Luke says he did. He wouldn't have been able to give himself up and die in his human nature, because we don't believe the divine nature died. We don't believe the divine person died. So if he would have only had that attribute, he would not have been able to have died. He wouldn't have been able to have died for our sins on the cross. So it would kind of really make Christianity almost moot if he would have only had a divine nature. It would have really eliminated the whole aspect of suffering, because if your divine nature inside a human body, wouldn't that have I'm trying to think of hypotheticals, would he have even really suffered if his nature was that of divinity only in a human body?
Well,
It's a good question.
presumably, if he had a human body, he would have had a brain and central nervous system and bones to
Which
pierce
is
and
part of the
blood to
human nature,
pour.
though,
And
to have pain, though, right?
well, this is why it's so hard, because now we're trying to figure, okay, what
Yeah.
exactly falls under the category of human nature.
Yeah.
We're talking about basically physiological capacities for
Sure.
pain, which all vertebrates and creatures with a nervous system have the capability to feel, but we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about
Yeah.
cow nature or fish
Right.
nature. We're more
Yeah.
concerned with human nature because there's so much more on top of that,
Oh, yeah.
with emotions and personalities and deep thoughts and desires and wants and all that stuff.
I think I mean, I'm going to give a really good example. I think his human nature is very strongly evinced when we see the devil trying to tempt him, and he rebukes the temptations from his human nature. And I think his human nature is also on display when he says that he doesn't know the time, the day, or the hour when the end of the world is going to come. Now, you wouldn't expect somebody with only a divine nature in a human body to say that. If its very makeup would have been that of only divinity, he would not have been able to have been ignorant of anything, because we would have believed him to have been omnipotent, omniscient, all those omnis. Yet in Mark and Matthew, he does make it very clear. He doesn't know the day, the time, or the hour. Only the Father in heaven does. But then his divine nature is on full display in the book of Revelation, because once he's died and resurrected and then ascended to heaven, returned to glory with the Father, the book of Revelation then does have him being omniscient. So I think that even though we don't have it hammered out the way church councils later did, I think the Bible does show us the fact that he had a distinct human nature and a distinct divine nature that still worked in unity with each other.
But do you think human nature necessarily
One another.
involves facts that one does or does not know? Like there's
Maybe not.
it might be able to be. I guess I'd be willing to say it can be informed by, there are certain facts that can change one's mind about a particular.
Sure.
They could change their attitudes about the world, but I'm not sure that a knowledge about when the end times are coming would have an effect on Christ's human nature any more than my knowledge of, I don't know, the 50 state capitals would have affected my nature in middle school or whenever I learned those.
Right, but it would have shown his limitation. It would have shown that he wasn't only composed of a divine nature in a human body. Is really the only point that I was trying to make, because the question is posed to him: when are these things going to come? And his response is one that is quite limited. And I've seen evangelicals and Catholics have difficulty dealing with that. When posed the question by Jehovah's Witnesses or Muslims, how do you reply to that? I think that it's showing, I think his human limitation is on full display there. And I think that we see the fact that once he has returned to glory with the Father, we can see that he does have that attribute, and that is part of his divine nature.
So, what about, let's say, when he goes into the garden to pray,
Yeah,
pre crucifixion?
sure.
Why would obviously there could be, he's not really praying for God to let him in on something he does not know. He's
Right.
praying that God's will be done.
Yeah,
And he's asking for this cup to be taken from him, or
sure.
if not, let God's will be done. But surely, having that divine nature, he knows that God's will is going to be done no matter what. So,
Sure.
what would be the purpose of praying in that case? He's not making an example for the disciples because they're all asleep over there, so they're not even seeing what he's praying about.
Right.
So
But they
where does
did
that?
see, but they did see him. They did see the example of prayer come from him even
Mhm.
before that. So he's doing there is being consistent in terms of how prayer was to be. Because remember, even though they may not have seen him praying at that very time,
Mhm.
he did give them the prayer of the Our Father before.
Mhm.
And the one key thing is he tells them that that prayer is for them, not for him.
Mhm.
So he had already given them the model of how to pray. And then he begins praying to the Father. When we look at that as Catholics, we don't look at it and say, okay, he's praying. And I'm glad you didn't make the caricature of saying, well, why is he praying to himself? I frequently see that caricature being made and people not understanding the doctrine of the Trinity.
Mhm.
We believe that the very fact that Christ prayed to the Father shows the fact that they were in unity in everything. They were one in terms of mission, which is why if you look in that very same gospel, a little bit forward, a few chapters later, he does tell them, when you see me, you've seen the Father. He doesn't mean that they're the same person. He's talking about in terms of their essence, in terms of the nature, the divine nature. They were one in that sense.
Now, it sounds like, okay, from the outside looking in, are we sure that it seems like there's almost an equivocation going on when Christ is he's a human nature is put forth when we're wanting to show him as being able to be an example for us and be a representative for us and show that he understands human suffering and to point out his sacrifice that he made for us by being a human being and suffering and dying.
Sure.
But he's also divine when we want to show him as being authoritative, being powerful, being someone who we are required to emulate and follow
Emulate.
and worship.
Mhm.
And it seems like the when the doctrine of the Trinity was finally made orthodoxy, it's just the church saying he's both. He's just both. That's the way it is. Don't say otherwise because you're a heretic now. Is
Okay,
that
so let me kind of try and break it down because I'm kind of a little confused. Are you making the argument that maybe the Bible doesn't present him as God? Or I'm kind of confused. Or are you making the
no? I'm
argument that
not.
the
I'm not
Bible?
making that
Okay,
argument specifically.
okay.
I'm just talking about.
Are you saying maybe the Bible isn't clear? Or I'm kind of confused. Because yeah, I agree. When we come to the doctrine of the Trinity and it being dogmatized, it's very technical in its language.
Mhm.
But I believe the very heart of everything it's teaching can be found within the Bible. So I'm just wondering, I don't quite understand. Are you
Well,
saying it's not very clear as to the Trinity being in the Bible, or I'm kind of confused?
there's very few references. I mean, I know it can be pieced together from various pieces of scripture.
Okay.
And
Sure.
there's no place where it's this is kind of similar to what I was saying before about the resurrection and the contradictions in there.
Sure.
You can you can acknowledge it as human stuff, but it's still more confusing than is necessary, in my opinion, for a
Okay.
divinely inspired document. And I would once again I would think that if this were so important, that God would at some point just say, okay, you want to know about the Trinity? Here's everything you need to know about the Trinity, and just lay it on the line. It wouldn't be something that we would need to piece together. It wouldn't have taken centuries for it to become the standard of the church. And you'd be right that people were espousing this early on, and it just took some time
Mhm.
to weed through the alternative views. But
Would you make the argument? I'm curious. Would you make the argument that in order for the Trinity to be clear, that we would have to have it in one book clearly enunciated? Or would it be fair to say that if we find a doctrine in the Bible, whereas it may not be clearly laid out in one book, we can find it in the Old Testament in different books and in the New Testament spread out through many books? Would that still be fair to be able to say that?
well, I think it would avoid a lot of. Wouldn't you agree? It could avoid a lot of confusion if we had it. If we had a
Well,
nice. Okay, let's have the Book of the Trinity, and we'll slap it right between Third John and Jude, and this is going to tell you everything you need to know. That sounds good to me. I don't know
well,
what the problem is doing it that way.
that, that's pretty good. That is pretty good. But I think you do have the model of it early on. Maybe you don't have a book, like you say, um, laying it all out the way we've done that. But why have we done that? We've done that so we can understand things clearer. We've done that so we can be able to have things, really, it's as funny as it may sound, be a lot simpler. So when I look at the doctrine of the Trinity, I find it, well, first off, I think it's very important to really talk about how do we get to believing in the Holy Trinity in the first place. I think it's very clear and laid out all throughout the Bible. Because if you look at the very first commandment, what is the first commandment? I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have any strange gods before me. You're not to commit idolatry. You're to worship the one true God only. There's a particular word used in the Bible for God, for worship to be given to God. That is the Greek word latria, latruo. If you think about the word idolatry, that's where we get idolatry from. Idolatria is giving worship to a false god. Latria is giving worship to the true God. So we can come to the doctrine of the Trinity quite clearly, even though to modern audiences it might be difficult, because the Bible does lay it out very clearly that you are to worship the Father by giving the Father latria. You are to worship Christ. The Bible does use the Greek word for latruo, to give Christ latria. And the Bible also uses the Greek word latruo, latria, for the Holy Spirit. And if we follow what the Bible says of one in the first commandment, that you are to worship God and God alone, then that does give us a hint that if you are to worship these three distinct persons, they are part of the Godhead, not part in the sense of pieces of the Godhead, but they are persons of the Godhead. They are distinct persons that make up a triune God. So I know maybe it still might sound a little confusing, but the people that read the Jewish Bible and the Greek Bible and that were acquainted with it, they had no problem believing it. That is really why we really had no real issue until we get to Nicaea, when you have Arius, espousing heresy. But even Arius kind of believed in a very distorted version of the Trinity. He believed Christ to have been God, but like a tiny little God, like a created kind of God. So we don't really have any full-blown denial of God being triune until much later.
Well, I mean, you have. I mean, not necessarily with the triune aspect. You know, I'll retract that. I was going to talk about other heresies, but like
Well,
docetism
Gnosticism. Oh
or
yeah.
stuff
Oh
like
yeah.
that.
Well,
But that necessary. But the God, but Jesus could still be God in those aspects. Just that the specific
right.
formulations
And,
are
and,
different.
and
So
they
I'll
weren't part of the Orthodox group. So yeah, I meant within Orthodox.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I'll set that aside because I realized as I was saying it that it might not apply.
Right. Right.
Um, let's see. Let me ask you one other thing, just out of curiosity, before we sign off
Sure.
here, because time stamping this, we're in the middle of coronavirus lockdown.
Oh yeah.
I got my full work from home beard going on
There we
here.
go.
How is the Catholic Church in a time like this where you can't congregate? How do you do sacraments like confession, communion? How are those still made available when you can't congregate like you normally would physically?
Okay. So there's really no answer that I can give without angering one group of people. If I tell you we should not be gathering at all, because right now it's a very dangerous time. And if somebody goes and meets with a priest and maybe they're a carrier and they get their elderly priest sick and he dies, that's very wrong. But if I say that, I'm going to anger one group of Catholics to say
Mm-hmm.
God should be protecting the priests and the people no matter what, which really that's making a caricature of the way we view God. And then there's another side that says you need to be very careful. These priests are elderly. We need to keep our distance as much as we can until maybe this blows over, there's a vaccine or what have you. We should be abstaining from communion for the time being. And I tend to fall in that line.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to fall in the line because I have seen a lot of elderly priests. I've seen them get physically sick. And I have a friend of mine who is a nurse right now, has worked with many elderly people. He had many elderly, I don't want to say clients, people that he was taking care of. And he became a carrier. He was quite young. Nothing happened to him. He got better. Something did happen to him. He got sick,
Mm-hmm.
but he got better. But 70% of his clients died. They died. They got it and they died. So to have the mentality that you should not put your own effort into this and God is a puppet master and you should really just ignore any warning is ignorant, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad the majority of bishops agree with that because it's not a matter of, hey, I don't trust God. It's not that. It's a matter of, hey, I can get this and pass this on to other people. And really, it can become even worse than it already is.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, the church has always taught that if you can't get to confession, you can directly pray to God. And you should always directly pray to God. We believe confession is a sacrament as taught in John chapter 20, verse 22. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't also confess to God. The church has always taught that you better confess your sins to God. And at a time like this, when the sacraments aren't available the way they normally are, or really even at all for a lot of people, it is recommended to pray and to fast very often.
Gotcha. Yeah, I figured there was some guidance out there for how to handle it. I just didn't
Yeah,
happen to know what it was. It was kind of interesting, but
yeah, and there are some very, um, very traditional people that believe that this is a hoax.
mm-hmm.
Ignore it. Go take communion. God will protect you,
Mm-hmm.
and that is a very dangerous kind of mentality.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, there are exceptions in across all faiths and
Oh,
lack
no
of
doubt.
faiths, I'm sure. But hopefully, enough people will be smart about it and listen to the guidance, and we'll all be getting together with our friends and loved ones and congregations soon enough and being able to get back to that. But
I agree. Yeah.
uh, in the meantime, William, thank you so much for joining us once again. Enjoyed the conversation. I don't know when this will be going up, but people want to find out about any other debates you have coming up or any other appearances. Where can they go to find out more?
They can go to www.patristickpillars.com. I've got all my information there, and I'm going to be debating Dan Barker again. We're going to be dialoguing on the contradictions in the Bible and on the problem of evil and suffering. I will be debating more within the field of atheism. I really enjoy it. I have a lot of atheist friends, and I love being on your show. Hopefully, we can talk about the Eucharist, Eucharistic miracles in the future. Would love to be back on.
Yeah, by all means, send me that info. You can certainly
Sure
also
will.
open to take a look at it. And when you talk to Dan Barker, be sure you bring up, hey, this guy Chris, you don't know, had all this stuff to say about contradictions, and I'm sure he'll take what I have to say with the utmost respect and as
You should
super
have him on your
important.
show. Maybe have him on your show one of these days.
Yeah, hey Jim, reach out to Dan Barker and we'll get him on. Well, he was here in Dallas a while back. I don't think I got to talk to him
Okay.
recently, but he was
Oh, wow.
yeah, I got to see him speak in person. So,
Very
William,
cool.
thanks for joining us. Internet, thank you for watching Atheist Edge, and stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you again real soon.